a Chao Valley, Vietnam, February 1968. The crack of Sergeant Thomas Silent, Reed's M14, echoed through the jungle like a thunderclap, announcing his position to every enemy soldier within 1,000 meters. 3 seconds later, return fire shredded the foliage around him, AK-47 rounds, RPG fragments, and the distinctive snap of a Dragunov sniper rifle targeting the source of that telltale American rifle report. Thomas rolled away from his position, cursing under his breath. Third time this week. Third time his own weapon had betrayed him, turning him from hunter into hunted the moment he pulled the trigger. The M14 was accurate, reliable, and absolutely terrible for the kind of silent elimination work his reconnaissance unit desperately needed. "Reed, you okay?" Corporal Martinez called from 30 meters away, his voice tight with concern. "Fine. Displacing." Thomas low-crawled through the undergrowth, putting distance between himself and the compromised position. Behind him, enemy fire continued to tear apart the spot where he'd been seconds ago. They knew exactly where to shoot because his rifle had told them. The mission had been simple. Eliminate 3 VC sentries guarding a supply trail, then withdraw before the main enemy force could respond. Thomas had taken the first sentry cleanly. Perfect shot, instant kill. But the sound had alerted everyone within half a mile. Now his 4-man team was running for their lives instead of completing the mission. "This is Recon 2-3, Lieutenant Morrison reported over the radio, breathing hard as they moved through the jungle. "Mission abort. Compromise of position, requesting immediate extraction." The radio crackled with the battalion commander's frustrated response. "Negative 2-3. That supply trail needs to be shut down tonight. Find another approach or don't come back." Morrison killed the transmission and glared at Thomas. "Your rifle just cost us the mission, Reed, again." "Sir, any rifle would have made the same noise. The M14 isn't uniquely loud, but it's loud enough to get us killed every time you fire it." Morrison's face was flushed with anger and fear. 3 times this week, Reed. 3 times we've had to abort because your shots announce our presence like a goddamn dinner bell. Then give me a suppressed weapon, sir. The SEAL teams have them. Special Forces has them. Why doesn't Recon have access to... Because the budget doesn't cover fancy equipment for every soldier who wants to play spy, Sergeant. You work with what you've got, or you find another job. Thomas bit back his response. Morrison was young, inexperienced and scared, a dangerous combination in an officer. But he was also right about one thing. The M14's report was getting people killed. Not Thomas, not yet, but eventually. The VC counter-snipers were learning, adapting, responding faster each time that distinctive crack announced an American shooter's position. That night, back at the firebase, Thomas sat in his hooch, cleaning his rifle and thinking about sound. The M14 was loud, because that's how guns worked. Controlled explosions creating supersonic projectiles, shock waves expanding at the speed of sound, pressure waves propagating through air. You couldn't eliminate that physics without changing fundamental aspects of how firearms functioned. But you could dampen it, redirect it, absorb some of the energy before it reached enemy ears. Thomas pulled out a battered book he'd found in the firebase library, a WWI tactical manual from 1917, full of trench warfare innovations developed when soldiers needed to kill quietly in close quarters. One chapter caught his attention. Improvised sound suppression techniques using metal tubes, baffles and packing material to reduce muzzle report. Trench rifles, the manual called them. Modified weapons that French and British snipers had used to eliminate sentries without alerting nearby enemy positions. The techniques were crude by modern standards. No precision manufacturing, no advanced materials. Just practical engineering using whatever soldiers could scavenge from battlefields. "What you reading, Sarge?" Private Jenkins asked, appearing with 2 warm beers liberated from the officer's mess. WWI Sniper Manual, looking at how they reduced rifle noise in the trenches. They had suppressors back then? Not like modern ones, but they understood the principle. If you can slow and cool the expanding gases before they exit the muzzle, you reduce the pressure wave, which reduces the sound. Thomas traced diagrams in the manual showing metal tubes with drilled holes, packed with asbestos fiber to absorb heat and pressure. It's crude, but the physics is sound. You thinking of building one? I'm thinking our current situation is unsustainable. Either I find a way to make this rifle quieter, or someone dies because I keep announcing our position every time I fire. Jenkins took a long drink of his beer. Morrison finds out you're modifying your rifle. He'll have you court-martialed for destroying military property. You know how he is about regulations. Morrison's going to get us all killed because he's more worried about regulations than tactics. Thomas closed the manual. But yeah, I'd need to be careful. Can't exactly walk up to the armorer and ask for help building an unauthorized weapon modification. What do you need? Thomas looked at his friend, seeing the question behind the question. Jenkins was offering to help, knowing it could mean trouble for both of them if they got caught. Metal tubing about 3 inches in diameter, steel wool or similar packing material, drill and bits, hacksaw, and absolute discretion. I can get that stuff. Maintenance section has spare parts from damaged equipment. Nobody tracks it closely. Jenkins finished his beer. When do we start? Tomorrow night, after Morrison's asleep. This stays between us, until I know it works. They worked in a maintenance shed on the fire base perimeter, using salvaged parts and hand tools to create something that would either revolutionize their mission profile or get Thomas court-martialed. The principle was simple. Attach an expansion chamber to the rifle's muzzle, drill holes to bleed off gases at controlled rates, pack the chamber with steel wool to absorb heat and slow expansion. The devil was in the details. Too much restriction and the rifle wouldn't cycle properly. Too little and the sound reduction would be negligible. Thomas measured twice and cut once, using calipers liberated from the motor pool to ensure precise dimensions. The expansion chamber had to be exactly the right length to allow gases to expand without creating back pressure that would damage the rifle. The bleed holes had to be positioned to redirect pressure away from the shooter while minimizing the acoustic signature. "This looks insane," Jenkins said, watching Thomas pack steel wool into the improvised suppressor, like something from a Mad Max movie. "It looks like desperate field improvisation," Thomas corrected, "which is exactly what it is. The SEAL teams get proper suppressors machined by defense contractors. We get whatever we can build from garbage because the budget doesn't cover black NCOs with crazy ideas." "You really think Morrison would approve this if you were white?" Thomas stopped working, considering the question honestly. "Maybe. Or maybe he'd still call it unauthorized modification and threaten charges. But I know for certain that my ideas get dismissed faster and with less consideration because of my skin color. That's not paranoia. That's pattern recognition based on 18 months of lived experience." "So we're doing this regardless?" "We're doing this because Marines are dying. If Morrison wants to court-martial me for trying to keep them alive, that's his choice. But I'm not watching another recon team get shredded because our rifles are too loud to use tactically." By 300 hours, they had a prototype. It wasn't pretty, a length of steel pipe attached to the M14's muzzle with improvised threading, packed with steel wool, with precisely drilled ports to bleed gases. The whole assembly added about 8 inches to the rifle's length and looked like exactly what it was. Something built in a maintenance shed by soldiers who didn't have access to proper equipment. "Moment of truth," Thomas said, chambering around. "We test this, we can't take it back. Someone's going to hear the shot and ask questions. Fire it into the sand berm by the perimeter, late enough that most people will assume it's just nervous sentries." Thomas moved to the edge of the firebase, positioned himself behind a protective berm, and aimed at a sandbag target 50 meters away. He exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired, but instead of the sharp crack that normally announced his position to half the valley, there was a muffled thump, still audible, but dramatically quieter, maybe 60% sound reduction. Definitely not silent, but quiet enough that the report wouldn't carry more than 200 meters. "Holy shit," Jenkins breathed. It actually worked. Thomas cycled the action. The rifle chambered the next round smoothly. No feeding issues, no pressure problems. He fired again. Same result. The improvised suppressor was functioning, reducing noise without compromising the weapon's reliability. "It works," Thomas said, lowering the rifle. "It actually works. A WWWI technique, adapted for modern rifles, built with salvaged materials in a maintenance shed. And it works. Morrison's going to lose his mind. Morrison can join the long line of officers who've lost their minds over my unauthorized innovations." Thomas examined the suppressor, checking for damage or heat warping. "But first, he's going to see it work in combat. Tomorrow night, we're going back to that supply trail, and this time we're completing the mission. Achau Valley, February 1968, Tornbiese 200 hours. Recon. 2-3 moved through the jungle like ghosts. 4 men on a mission that had already failed once because of noise discipline. Lieutenant Morrison had initially refused to allow Thomas to use the modified rifle, calling it unauthorized equipment and threatening disciplinary action. But the battalion commander had been explicit: shut down that supply trail or don't come back. Morrison chose mission success over regulations, though his disapproval was evident in every clipped word and hostile glance. "Reed, you get one chance," Morrison had said during the briefing. "If that homemade silencer fails, if it jams your rifle, if it causes any problems whatsoever, you're facing court-martial for destroying military property. Clear?" "Clear, sir." Now they were back in the valley, approaching the same VC supply trail from a different angle. Thomas carried his modified M14, the improvised suppressor looking crude and desperate in the moonlight. Martinez carried the radio, Jenkins had the backup weapon, and Morrison carried the weight of command and the knowledge that he'd just authorized equipment modification that violated half a dozen regulations. 3 sentries, same positions as last time, Thomas reported, observing through his scope. 70 meters, elevated standard rotation pattern. They're expecting us. They've increased the watch since our last attempt. "Can you take them quietly?" Morrison asked. "That's what we're about to find out, sir." Thomas moved into position, finding a stable shooting platform with clear sight lines to all 3 targets. The suppressor added weight to the front of the rifle, changing the balance slightly, but he'd practiced with it enough to compensate. The first sentry was lighting a cigarette. Bad discipline, but good for Thomas. The glowing ember gave him a precise aiming point in the darkness. He controlled his breathing, let his heart rate settle, and squeezed the trigger. The suppressed rifle made a sound like someone hitting a wooden post with a rubber mallet, still audible up close, but nothing like the sharp crack that had compromised them before. The first sentry dropped without a sound, the cigarette falling from his lips as the bullet found center mass. Thomas cycled the action. The rifle chambered smoothly. The suppressor was functioning perfectly. Second sentry, 15 seconds later, same muffled report, same clean kill. The body fell into the undergrowth, unnoticed by the third sentry who was facing the wrong direction, watching the trail approach instead of the jungle behind him. Third sentry, 20 seconds after that, Thomas adjusted for wind, compensated for the slight elevation difference, and fired. The suppressed round took the sentry in the back of the head, instant, silent, final. 3 down, Thomas whispered into the radio. Trail is clear. Martinez moved forward to confirm the kills, while Jenkins provided overwatch. Morrison stayed beside Thomas, staring at the modified rifle like it was an artifact from another world. "That actually worked," Morrison said quietly. You're Your homemade suppressor actually worked. WWI technology, sir. Adapted for modern application. The French were doing this in 1917. We just forgot the lessons because peacetime military focuses on regulations instead of innovation. Read, that rifle is illegal. What you've done violates procurement regulations, armorer certification requirements, and probably half a dozen safety codes I don't even know about. Yes, sir, but it also just saved this mission and possibly our lives. So I guess the question is, do you care more about regulations or results? Morrison was silent for a long moment, watching Martinez signal the all clear. If this works, if we can replicate this modification, how many rifles could you convert? As many as we have materials for, sir. The basic principle is simple. Any competent soldier with access to hand tools could build one in a few hours. That's not what I asked. I asked if you could convert them, not train others, not distribute the technique. You, specifically. Thomas understood immediately. Morrison wanted the capability, but didn't want to officially acknowledge or approve it. If Thomas built the suppressors quietly, Morrison could maintain plausible deniability while benefiting from the tactical advantage. I can convert rifles, sir, discreetly, but if someone up the chain asks where they came from, I'll handle that if it happens, Morrison interrupted. For now, let's focus on completing this mission. We can worry about regulations later. They moved down the trail, past the bodies of the sentries Thomas had eliminated so quietly that the main VC camp 200 meters away remained unaware. The silence was profound, disturbing. Usually combat was loud, rifles cracking, explosions thundering, men shouting. This was different. This was professional, surgical, terrifying in its efficiency. How many rounds can you fire before that suppressor stops working? Martinez asked as they moved. Don't know yet, Thomas admitted. The steel wool will burn out eventually from the heat and pressure. Maybe 50 rounds, maybe 100. I won't know until it fails, and I'd rather not find out during combat. So you built experimental equipment without knowing its operational limits. Read, that's exactly what field innovation looks like, Martinez. You try something, you test it under real conditions. You learn from the results. The alternative is waiting for proper equipment that never arrives because the budget doesn't cover it. They reached the supply cache, hidden under camouflage netting, stacked with ammunition, rice, medical supplies, more than they could destroy or carry. Martinez called in coordinates for artillery, while Thomas provided security, his suppressed rifle ready but quiet. The artillery strike came 15 minutes later, obliterating the cache and announcing their presence to every VC unit in the valley. But by then, Recon 2-3 was already moving toward the extraction point, mission accomplished, no casualties. Back at the firebase, word spread fast. The recon team that had failed 3 times had suddenly succeeded, eliminating sentries and destroying a major supply cache without alerting the enemy until it was too late. Other recon teams wanted to know how. Other snipers wanted to see the modified rifle, and Thomas found himself at the center of attention he'd rather have avoided. "Let me see it," Gunnery Sergeant Kowalski demanded, examining the improvised suppressor like a jeweler studying a questionable diamond. Kowalski was the senior NCO for the battalion's reconnaissance units, a veteran of Korea and early Vietnam who'd seen every field modification imaginable. Thomas handed over the rifle, watching Kowalski inspect every detail of the improvised suppressor. "WWI technique," Kowalski said after a long examination. "French trench rifles use something similar. I've seen photographs in old manuals, but never seen one in person." He looked at Thomas with new respect. "You built this yourself? No armorer support?" "Yes, Gunny. Jenkins helped with materials, but the design and assembly were mine. And it works. Actually reduces sound signature enough to matter tactically. Yes, Gunny. Maybe 60% reduction, enough that sentries 200 meters away didn't hear the shots that killed their comrades." Kowalski nodded slowly. Reed, what you've built here is either going to revolutionize how we conduct reconnaissance operations, or it's going to get you court-martialed for equipment tampering. Possibly both. The question is, can you teach others to build them? Yes, Gunny. The principle is simple enough that any soldier with basic mechanical aptitude could replicate it. Good, because starting tomorrow, you're going to teach every designated marksman in this battalion how to modify their rifles, quietly, unofficially. And if anyone asks where the technique came from, you're going to say it's a revival of historical methods from WWI manuals found in the Firebase library. Gunny, that's not exactly true. It's true enough to provide cover. The brass doesn't need to know you invented this through desperate necessity. They just need to know it works, and it's based on documented historical precedent. Kowalski handed back the rifle. You're a good NCO, Reed. You saw a problem, you found a solution, and you had the balls to implement it despite knowing it could end your career. That's the kind of thinking that wins wars. But it's also the kind of thinking that threatens officers who prefer regulations to results. So I hide behind historical precedent? You use historical precedent as justification for field adaptation of proven techniques. There's a difference. One sounds like unauthorized modification. The other sounds like tactical innovation based on research and necessity. Kowalski smiled grimly. Welcome to the politics of military innovation, Reed. Where being right isn't enough, you also have to be diplomatically careful about how you present your ideas. Over the next week, Thomas trained 12 reconnaissance snipers in the construction and use of improvised suppressors. Each one was built from salvaged materials, each one reduced sound signature by approximately 60%, and each one gave reconnaissance teams a tactical capability they desperately needed, but never had budget to acquire through official channels. The VC noticed the change immediately. Suddenly, their sentries were dying without warning shots. Their supply caches were being destroyed by teams that approached silently. Their counter-sniper tactics were failing because American snipers weren't announcing their positions anymore. The entire tactical dynamic shifted, all because of a black sergeant who'd read a WWI manual and refused to accept that loud rifles were inevitable. Achau Valley, March 1968. The improvised suppressors spread through reconnaissance units like wildfire, past NCO to NCO, through informal channels that bypassed official procurement entirely. Within 3 weeks, 47 rifles had been modified. Within 6 weeks, over 100. Each one was built from salvaged materials, each one cost essentially nothing, and each one gave American forces a tactical advantage the VC couldn't counter. But success brought scrutiny. Division headquarters noticed that reconnaissance teams were suddenly completing missions with unprecedented stealth. Intelligence reports showed VC units expressing confusion about ghost Americans who killed without sound, and inevitably, someone up the chain of command demanded to know what had changed. Captain Morrison, explain these reports, Colonel Bradshaw demanded during a staff meeting at Division HQ. Your reconnaissance teams are showing a 73% increase in successful silent eliminations. What new equipment have you deployed? Morrison chose his words carefully. Sir, we've implemented historical techniques from WWI trench warfare, sound suppression methods documented in period manuals, adapted for modern rifles using field-available materials. Historical techniques. Bradshaw's tone was skeptical. With what authorization? Who approved modifications to military equipment? The modifications are based on established historical precedent, sir. No new technology, just revival of proven methods from 1917-1918 French and British sniper operations. I don't care if they're based on Roman siege tactics, Captain. You modified military equipment without authorization. That's a court-martial offense. Bradshaw looked around the room. Who developed this technique? Morrison hesitated, knowing his answer would determine Thomas's future. Sergeant Thomas Reed, sir. He researched historical methods and adapted them for current tactical needs. A sergeant, a black sergeant, according to these personnel files. Bradshaw's expression hardened. And you let an enlisted man, a black enlisted man, modify rifles without proper authorization, testing, or safety certification? The racial emphasis wasn't subtle. Morrison felt his face flush with anger and shame. Sir, Sergeant Reed's modification has saved lives and dramatically improved our mission success rate. The technique works. That should matter more than regulations or... He almost said the color of his skin, but caught himself, or the rank of the person who developed it. What should matter, Captain, is chain of command and proper procedure, not field modifications by NCOs who think they know better than Army R&D. Bradshaw turned to his aide. I want Sergeant Reed brought to Division HQ. I want every modified rifle confiscated and inspected by armorers. And I want a full investigation into how this unauthorized equipment spread through an entire battalion without anyone following proper channels. Morrison returned to his firebase, knowing he'd failed to protect Thomas from the bureaucratic backlash. The technique worked, lives were being saved, but the system cared more about procedure than results, and especially couldn't tolerate innovation that came from a black NCO operating outside official channels. Reed, you need to report to Division HQ, Morrison said, finding Thomas cleaning his rifle after a mission. Colonel Bradshaw wants to discuss your suppressor modification. Discuss, sir? Or court-martial? Honestly, probably the latter. He's not happy that an enlisted man, especially a black enlisted man, developed equipment that the system didn't approve. You're about to become a lesson in why soldiers should follow regulations instead of innovating. Thomas set down his rifle slowly. Sir, those suppressors have saved lives. We're completing missions that were impossible before. The VC can't counter tactics they can't hear, and Bradshaw wants to shut it down because I didn't fill out the right forms. Bradshaw wants to shut it down because it makes the system look bad. You prove that a sergeant with salvaged materials can develop better equipment than Army R&D with million-dollar budgets. That's threatening to people who built careers on being the official source of innovation. So I take the fall to protect the system's ego? Morrison met his eyes. I'm going to fight for you, Reed. I'll testify that your modification was tactically necessary, historically grounded, and operationally successful. But I'm a junior captain, and Bradshaw's a full colonel. The odds aren't in your favor. The next morning, Thomas reported to Division HQ, expecting charges and preparing his defense. Instead, he found Colonel Bradshaw flanked by 2 civilian contractors in expensive suits and a major from Army R&D. Sergeant Reed, Bradshaw began formally, you've created an interesting situation. On one hand, you modified military equipment without authorization, a serious offense. On the other hand, your modification has proven tactically effective and is based on documented historical methods. The Army has to decide whether to punish you or study what you've created. Sir, I was trying to keep Marines alive, not create a bureaucratic problem. Your intentions are noted, but your methods violated regulations, safety protocols, and proper channels. You should have submitted your idea through official innovation programs, not built unauthorized equipment in maintenance sheds. Bradshaw gestured to the civilians. These gentlemen are from Colt Defense Contractors. They've examined your suppressor design and have some questions. The lead contractor, a grey-haired engineer named Wilson, pulled out photographs of Thomas's improvised suppressor. Sergeant Reed, this is brilliant work. The baffle design, the gas bleed ports, the thermal packing, you've created a functional suppressor using principles that defense contractors charge thousands to develop. Where did you learn firearms engineering? WWI manual, sir, and practical necessity. I needed a quieter rifle, so I figured out how to build one. With no formal training, no engineering degree. No, sir. Just understanding of how sound works and willingness to experiment. Wilson exchanged glances with his colleague. Sergeant, Colt would like to offer you a consulting position. Help us refine and manufacture a production version of your design. You'd receive appropriate compensation and credit. The Army doesn't rent out its soldiers as consultants, Bradshaw interrupted coldly. Sergeant Reed is military property, not a freelance engineer. Then perhaps the Army would be interested in licensing Sergeant Reed's design. Wilson countered, we could manufacture suppressors based on his principles, distribute them through official channels, give soldiers the equipment they clearly need. At what cost per unit? Approximately $800, accounting for manufacturing, testing, and certification requirements. Thomas couldn't help himself. Sir, my version costs about $12 in salvaged materials and 2 hours of labor. You want to charge $800 for essentially the same thing. Your version is a field expedient, Sergeant. Ours would be a certified, warranted, professionally manufactured product. That does exactly what mine does, for 66 times the cost. Thomas looked at Bradshaw. Sir, is this what happens to field innovation? We take something that works and make it expensive enough that most soldiers can't access it? Bradshaw's expression was unreadable. Reed, you're being insubordinate. Sir, I'm being honest. These contractors want to profit from innovation they didn't create. Charge the military a fortune for equipment. Soldiers are already building themselves for free, and the system will approve it because it comes through official channels rather than from an NCO who saw a problem and solved it. That's enough, Sergeant. Is it, sir? Because from where I'm standing, this meeting isn't about whether my suppressor works. Everyone agrees it does. It's about whether the Army can tolerate innovation that does not come from approved sources and does not generate corporate profits, and the answer appears to be no. The room went silent. Wilson looked uncomfortable. Bradshaw looked furious. And the major from R&D looked like someone trying very hard not to smile. Sergeant Reed, the major said carefully, your analysis is not entirely wrong. The military-industrial complex does tend to complicate simple solutions and inflate costs. But there are legitimate reasons for standardization, testing, and quality control. Sir, there are also legitimate reasons for letting soldiers build equipment they need with materials they have, rather than waiting years for contracts and procurement. My suppressor works now. It's saving lives now. A production version might be slightly better, but it'll arrive too late for the Marines currently fighting. Bradshaw stood abruptly. This meeting is over. Sergeant Reed, you're confined to firebase pending disciplinary review. Your modified rifles are to be confiscated and examined by armorers, and you're to cease all unauthorized equipment modification immediately. Dismissed. Thomas saluted and left, knowing he'd just torpedoed any chance of official recognition. But he'd also told the truth, and sometimes truth mattered more than career advancement. Back at the firebase, he found Gunnery Sergeant Kowalski waiting. Heard about your meeting with Bradshaw. Heard you told off defense contractors and basically accused the Army of valuing profits over soldiers' lives. Something like that, Gunny. Reed, you're either the bravest NCO I've met or the stupidest. Possibly both. Kowalski handed him a beer. But you're not wrong. The system does complicate simple solutions, and you did develop something valuable that the contractors want to steal and sell back to us at inflated prices. So what happens now? Now your suppressors stay in service despite official disapproval, because NCOs don't wait for permission to save lives. Now contractors develop an expensive version that some units will buy, while others keep building your improvised version. And now you become a cautionary tale about what happens when enlisted men innovate too effectively and threaten the established order. Sounds like I'm screwed, Gunny. Oh, you're definitely screwed. But you're screwed for the right reasons. You prioritized mission success over regulations, soldier safety over your career, and practical results over bureaucratic approval. That's the kind of screwed that matters. Kowalski raised his beer. To being screwed for the right reasons. They drank in silence, watching the sun set over Vietnam, knowing that Thomas' career had probably peaked that afternoon in Division HQ when he'd chosen honesty over politics. At Fort Benning, Georgia, 2003, the Infantry Museum had a new exhibit on Vietnam War innovations, and Thomas Reed stood in front of a glass case containing an M14 with an improvised suppressor attached. Not his original, but a replica built from his designs, accompanied by a placard explaining the historical technique and its tactical impact. Improvised sound suppression devices, developed by Reconnaissance units in 1968, provided significant tactical advantages in silent elimination missions, the placard read. Based on WWI trench warfare techniques, these field modifications demonstrated the ongoing value of historical research and practical innovation. No mention of his name, no credit for the specific development, just reconnaissance units and field modifications, as if the suppressors had spontaneously appeared rather than being designed by a specific person who'd risked court-martial to build them. Dad, that's yours, isn't it? His daughter Sarah was 28, an army captain herself, and she'd grown up hearing stories about the suppressor her father had built in a maintenance shed. Mine was cruder, Thomas said, less refined, but yeah, same principle. I developed that technique using WWI manuals in desperation. So why doesn't the placard mention you? Because the system doesn't like to acknowledge that a black NCO developed something Army R&D couldn't. Easier to credit reconnaissance units collectively than admit that innovation came from exactly the kind of soldier the system undervalues. Sarah looked at him with frustration and pride mixed together. That's not right. No, it's not. But it's reality. The important thing isn't who gets credit. It's that the technique worked and saved lives. Other soldiers learned it, adapted it, spread it. That matters more than my name in a museum. But even as he said it, Thomas felt the sting of erasure. His innovation, his risk, his contribution, all absorbed into the anonymous category of field modifications, as if technique developed itself without specific people having specific ideas. A young black sergeant approached them, studying the exhibit. So you know anything about who actually developed this? The placard's pretty vague. Thomas hesitated, then made a decision. I developed it. March 1968, Ashau Valley. Built the first prototype in a maintenance shed using WWI manuals and salvaged materials. Got threatened with court-martial for unauthorized equipment modification, but it worked well enough that other units adopted it anyway. The sergeant's eyes widened. You're him, the silent sniper. That was my call sign, yeah, before they tried to bury my contribution behind vague institutional credit. Sir, they still teach your technique at sniper school. We call it trench suppression now, and it's part of the curriculum on field improvisation. Every sniper in the army knows the method, even if they don't know who invented it. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. The credit didn't matter, the legacy did. The technique survived. Soldiers were still learning it. That was enough. What do they teach about it, he asked. That innovation can come from historical research. That field modifications sometimes outperform official equipment. That soldiers who study military history can find solutions to modern problems. The sergeant paused. And that the best innovations usually come from NCOs who are actually doing the work, not officers sitting in headquarters. They teach that last part officially? No, sir. That's what the instructors say unofficially. The official curriculum is very careful not to criticize the procurement system or suggest that headquarters doesn't know best. Thomas laughed, the sound bitter and knowing, same as it ever was. The truth gets taught in private, while the official story protects the system's ego. Sarah put her hand on his shoulder. Dad, you should write this down. Your story. The real story of who developed the suppressor and why, so it doesn't get completely erased. Who'd publish it? The Army doesn't want stories about black NCOs showing up their R&D departments. Defense contractors don't want reminders that they charge $800 for equipment that soldiers build for 12. Then publish it yourself, self-publish, blog, whatever. The truth matters, even if the system tries to bury it. Thomas looked at the exhibit again, at the replica of his suppressor presented as anonymous innovation rather than specific achievement by a specific person who'd risked everything to save lives the system couldn't protect. "Maybe I will," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time the real story got told, regardless of whether the system wants to hear it." That night, he started writing, not for glory or recognition, but for history, for the record. For every soldier who'd ever had a good idea dismissed because it came from the wrong rank or the wrong race or the wrong place in the military hierarchy. For every NCO who'd solved problems that officers couldn't, only to watch those solutions get credited to field innovations or unit initiatives without names attached. The story took 3 months to write. When he finished, he had a manuscript documenting not just the suppressor development, but the entire pattern of innovation, dismissal, bureaucratic resistance, and eventual anonymous adoption that characterized how the military actually handled creativity from unexpected sources. He published it online, expecting maybe a few hundred readers. Instead, it went viral among military communities. Veterans shared it. Active duty soldiers cited it. Training instructors started using excerpts to teach lessons about innovation and institutional resistance to change. "Your story's everywhere, Dad," Sarah called to tell him. "It's being discussed at the infantry school. Some captain wrote a whole analysis of it for a tactics journal. Does the analysis mention my name? Front and center. You're not anonymous anymore. The story's out there, and people know who actually developed the silent rifle modification." Thomas felt vindication finally after 35 years. Not from the system. The system would never acknowledge him properly, but from soldiers, from the community of people who actually fought and understood what innovation under fire really meant. The museum eventually updated its placard, adding his name and specific contribution after the online story made it impossible to maintain the fiction of anonymous development. Defense contractors quietly acknowledged that their expensive suppressors were based on Reed's field improvisation, and the Army Infantry School added a case study on his innovation to their curriculum on creative problem-solving. But the real legacy wasn't the recognition. It was the technique itself, still taught, still used, still saving lives decades after Thomas had built that first crude suppressor in a Vietnamese maintenance shed. Every time a soldier reduced their rifle's sound signature using principles Thomas had developed, his innovation lived on, regardless of who got credit, regardless of what the official story said. Sarah visited him one weekend, bringing her own children to meet the grandfather they knew as the silent sniper. He showed them the original suppressor, kept all these years, battered and worn, but still functional. "This thing changed how the Army thought about field modifications," he told them, "proved that soldiers could innovate as effectively as engineers, that historical research had practical value, and that good ideas could come from anywhere, even from a black NCO that the system wanted to ignore." "Why did they want to ignore you, Grandpa?" his grandson asked. "Because I threatened their assumptions, because I proved that expensive official solutions weren't always better than cheap improvised ones, and because I was black, which meant my ideas got dismissed faster and required more proof before being taken seriously." Thomas set down the suppressor. "But I didn't let dismissal stop me from trying. That's the real lesson. Don't wait for permission to innovate. Don't wait for the system to validate your ideas. If you see a problem and you have a solution, implement it and prove it works. Recognition comes later, if at all. Results matter more." The sun set through the window, casting long shadows across the room, where Thomas's legacy sat in a glass case, not in a museum where institutional memory controlled the narrative, but in his home, where the truth lived alongside the artifact that had started it all. The silent rifle technique lived on. Soldiers still learned it. Lives were still saved by it. And now, finally, people knew who had developed it and why. Not because the system wanted to acknowledge him, but because the truth had proved too stubborn to erase. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes knowing that your innovation outlived the bureaucratic attempts to suppress it was the only recognition that mattered. Thomas Reed had changed how an entire military branch thought about sound suppression, field modifications, and the value of historical research. He'd done it despite dismissal, despite threats, despite the system's determination to erase his contribution. And in the end, the truth won. Not quickly, not easily, but eventually, inevitably, the way truth always does when stubborn people refuse to let it be buried.